one thing I've learned. It's when you really need technology to work, that's when it doesn't work. So we're going to start working our way through Ruth. This is a book that I'm kind of excited to work through. It's one that a lot of us know the story of, but there's a lot of hidden details mixed in that often get overlooked. It's a pretty feel-good story too, kind of like Esther, but without all the bloody stuff at the end. There's a little bit more, well, a lot of Bible commentators say it's a romantic story in more ways than just the love story that's mixed in. So we're going to do the same thing that we did the other week there. I'll read a verse in succession of that. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And we're going to start right on verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons.
The name of the man was Amalek, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of the 2 sons were
Moab and Children.
Malon and Children. They were the Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Oh boy.
Whatever his name is, died. I'm sorry.
That's right.
And Naomi was left alone with her 2 sons.
The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Oprah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Malon and Kilion died. This left Naomi alone with her 2 sons, without her 2 sons or her husband.
She decided to return to Israel with her daughters-in-law, for she had heard that the Lord had blessed his people by giving them good crops again.
So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah.
But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me.
And may the Lord make it possible for each of you to marry again and have a home." So Naomi kissed them goodbye, and they started crying.
No, they said, "We want to go with you to your people."
But Naomi replied, "It is better for you to return to your own people. Do I have younger sons who could grow up to be your husbands?"
Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and would bear his sons.
Would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me.
Again they started crying. Then Oprah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and went back home, but Ruth held on to her.
"Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same."
But Ruth replied, "Don't make me leave you, for I want to go wherever you go, and to live wherever you live. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God.
Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you."
When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her.
They went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived, the whole town became excited, and the women there exclaimed, "Is this really Naomi?"
"Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me.
I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home empty. Why should you call me Naomi, when the Lord has turned his back on me and sent such calamity?"
So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. The Lord always blesses the reading of His holy word. So, we've got a new book. Like I said, Ruth is one that I've been looking forward to going through for a little while. It's a pretty interesting book, and there's a lot that commentators have to say about it. So there's a lot of information that I can glean from and bring to you guys. So from Haley's Bible Handbook, these are the two commentaries I usually use, Unger's and Haley's. They tend to bring the historical side forward a lot, not so much the theological side. And from Haley's, he says, it is a lovely story of a lovely woman stuck in perilous times. Ruth, when you just read it from the surface level without looking into the history, it seems like, peaceful fields, a woman coming back as a widow and her daughter-in-law staying with her, and it seems like everything is good to an extent. She's going to go find a husband. But there's a little bit more to it than that. There's something to keep in mind when you're reading Ruth. So the Moabites, which Ruth is, are descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. So if you remember back reading about Sodom and Gomorrah and stuff like that in the book of Genesis, Lot's descendants turned into the Moabites, and they kind of turned into cousins of the Israelites. So though they weren't Jews, it's more like cousins. Though they were cousins, they did not worship the same God, though. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, which I have a picture of behind here. And they worshipped him with baby sacrifices. So there's, the Israelites are here, the Moabites are in kind of a different camp over here. And one of the things that, I questioned when first reading the book is, well, Ruth isn't an Israelite, and I thought the Israelites were all about Israel. Like, you can't have any foreigners bringing in and stuff like that. So what do we think about this? Why does Ruth, a Moabite, want to stay in Israel, a land that's not her own? Worships a different God, different culture.
It could be as simple as she married Naomi's son, who was an Israelite, and started following the customs for it was a custom you do what your husband does.
Yeah, that's a good point there. So she would have started doing a lot of the customs. And if we read carefully, it says they go back to Israel because there's a famine going on in the country of Moab at the time. So there's this sense that, there's a return from destitution. And like you said, they would have been following the culture and stuff like that anyway. It always struck me as weird how the Israelites just accepted her, though. And this is probably because one of the things that a lot of people neglect to read in the Old Testament is that the Jewish law, though it is very specific that Jews should not marry outside of, Israelite culture, there's a really strong, how do I put it? You still need to treat outsiders well. And in that, we see, especially when we get towards the New Testament times, there's a lot of people who come out to worship God, even though they aren't Jewish or Israelites. And they're kind of this weird outsider faction. And some of them would be accepted into Jewish custom if they got circumcised and became a Jew. So because of this, because Ruth's husband would have been Jewish, she would have been accepted even though she was a foreigner, even though she was a Moabite. And like I said, the Moabites were kind of kissing cousins with the Israelites, so there's that little bit of acceptance there. It wasn't a completely foreigner who was coming in and didn't speak the language or anything like that. So let's take a look at where the book itself takes place. We know that they go down from the country of Moab, which if we look at is right down here in the southeast. And they go up towards Bethlehem, which is right here. So they would have had to go around the Dead Sea probably, if not sailed over it. But it's funny how we say, that's probably less distance than from here to Halifax. That's not really that far. But back then, that would have been a huge distance to move. It's roughly placed in the time of the Judges. So when you asked me the other couple weeks ago about how the Old Testament isn't in order at all, this is one of the very few times that there's a book directly after another book that's chronologically based. Ruth takes place, we're not sure during which judge, it's never specified, but it's during this time of Israel not having a king, not really having a national identity outside of the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's a lot of warfare going on, as the judges were there to, there would be raiding and pillaging upon Israel, and the judges would help stop that, or there would be a king that would rise up, and he was an evil king, and the judge would go and stop him. And it was this cyclical nature of evil coming, good triumphing over evil. But it made for, perilous times. It wasn't easy. So it takes place between 1400 BC and 1050 BC. Like I said, we're not sure during which judge this book necessarily takes place. So it's somewhere within that time frame. Like I said, it's one of the few times where things are placed together in the Old Testament. And we also have the question of who wrote this book and when. Well, we're not really sure. The author is anonymous. But it was most likely written around the time of David, which is not much longer than after where it would have happened. I'll kind of get into that a little bit more, because Ruth is an important character here when it comes to the Jesus narrative. Also, there seems to be famine in the land, which is what causes Ruth and Naomi to leave to Moab and then to come back again. There's a famine, so they go to Moab, and then there's another famine in Moab, so they go back to Jerusalem again. And this would have been fairly common. We see there were a couple times in the Old Testament where there was a famine in Israel. We see Joseph in the coat of many colors. There's a famine going on in Israel, so they go to Egypt to get food. This was common back then, where they didn't have agricultural practices that allowed for, constant food production. So let's get away from the history a little bit, and we're going to get into the book itself. Are there any questions so far? You guys want to point to it that I might? So Ruth says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." And like I said, Ruth is not an Israelite, she's a Moabite. So we kind of already answered this, but what kind of questions does this bring up? What do we know about Ruth because of what she says here?
She's devoted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a lot of self-sacrifice going on here. Back in those days, Israelite custom was that when there was a widow, the family would take care of the widow. The widow doesn't have any family left, aside from the daughters-in-law. So Ruth is almost committing suicide by staying with Naomi. Because unless she can get a husband pretty quick, or if she can find some other way for them to survive, things look kind of bleak for her, because Naomi can't marry again, she's too old. So there's a certain element of self-sacrifice and a willingness to, go into the unknown and trust this foreign God that she didn't even know her whole life. We also see that she's changing who she is for the love that she has for Naomi. She's going from her land with her gods, her people, and her family, to a foreign land with a foreign God and a foreign family. She's essentially changing who she is. She's changing her whole identity for Naomi because she cares for Naomi so much. And Naomi's pretty bleak with this too. She says, if I could have a son right now, would you wait for him to grow up before you married him, or would you marry somebody else first? Naomi is depressed about all of this. So here's a question. Who is Ruth the great-grandmother of? Do you guys know? I'll give you a hint, it's not Jesus.
It's around the time David.
Mm-hmm. It's King David. Yep. Which is funny because we see a Moabite woman being the great-grandmother of King David. So how could this affect the reading of this book? Actually, I'll pose a different question. Why is the book of Ruth in the Bible? I mean, it's a 4-chapter romance story. Why is it important? They're wrong answers.
Be because it shows that God doesn't love just one particular people, that everybody is kind of used to his ability for his purposes.
Yeah. That's a really good point, and that would definitely be one of the reasons. There's also the where this was written probably during the time of David, so 3 generations later. There's also the option that this was meant to kind of fill in some gaps of history kind of thing, where the family of David would have known a lot of these things, but probably not the rest of Israel. So there's this thing that's saying, this is kind of where our king came from. Does that make any sense? But there's a lot of really good theological stuff here too, like what you mentioned, that God uses the outsider. He uses the widow and her daughter-in-law. He uses the least of the least to bring the new king of Israel in. We also see God's providence in, them trusting in him, and then, of course we know Ruth gets married afterwards and everything's hunky-dory afterwards. There's that element of trusting in God leads to further blessings through him. So Ruth, although it's really short, it's shorter than Esther, and even though it's kind of a love story, for lack of better words, it's important that it is in the Bible. So let's take a look at Naomi. I'm a big fan of hers. This is an artist's take of Ruth taking Naomi under her wing and bringing her into Israel. And when we ask the question why she is so scared, like I said, she's an old widow with no family. There's no hope for her. She even changes her name to Mara to show her grief. And if you guys, I'm pulling on your old Hebrew skills here, and I'm sure all of you guys are masters of. But you know what the name Mara means, and what the name Naomi means?
And it comes to mind is Myra, which some dirty liar or something.
It's kind of close. Naomi means blessed one, and Mara means bitter one. She changes her name from blessed one of God to bitter, cranky, doesn't want anything to do with anybody because she knows that she's probably not going to have much time left. So here's another question. When I first read this chapter, the first thing that popped into my mind was, why do the people in Bethlehem not recognize Naomi? And there it is. Throwing a lot of questions at you guys this week. Well, for one, she had been gone for a while. She had family over in Moab and then came back. This is where she grew up. But there's also the fact that, grief can have a very physical toll on a person. She lost her husband, and then she lost her 2 sons, and now she realizes that she's probably going to die relatively soon. So there's this element of Naomi coming back and people kind of seeing a shell of what she used to be a little bit. That's going to get better. Like I said, Naomi is the pleasant one, and Mara is the bitter one. Now, when I wanted to talk about the romantic side of Ruth a little bit, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Princess Bride, but that's my favorite romance movie out there. It's a classic one. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's cheesy, it's fantastic. But when I say the romance of Ruth, I want us to look past the love story, which we're going to get into a little bit anyway. But there's a little bit more to it than that. There's also parallels of God loving Israel within the story of Ruth loving Boaz and Naomi. I think that's a little bit too small for you guys to read. But I want to say that this is going to be the ongoing theme of the book instead of the where is the God in this passage that we looked at in Esther. We're going to look at the romance of Ruth instead. Ruth is a book that's rich with symbolism of Israel as a nation and its relationship with God. We see this a lot with Naomi having a big family and being the blessed one of God, and then going to a foreign nation. And then what happens? Her family all dies, and destitution strikes her. But then when she goes back to Israel again, there's this sense of renewal. She seeks forgiveness. and she's brought back again, and she's blessed through Ruth. And there's this cyclical nature in the Old Testament of falling away from God and becoming destitute, and then coming back to God and being blessed again. We see this happen in Israel over and over and over again. And this is something that the book of Ruth picks up and flies with a little bit. Ruth and her sister-in-law, Orpah, represent the two sides of Israel, the unbelieving half and the faithful half. One of the sisters goes back to the pagan land where they sacrifice babies to their god for fertility and harvest and stuff like that. Whereas Ruth takes, like I said, this almost suicidal path to a place that she doesn't know, to a faith that she doesn't know. And she's blessed because of that. We never know what happens to Orpah. She might have had a fantastic life. She might have died as soon as she got back. We really don't know. So then, so too does Ruth represent the fulfillment of promises to the faithful who come back in more ways than one, because we see that through her, King David comes, and then through the lineage of David, we see Jesus come through as well. So there's this cyclical nature of Ruth that's really important to kind of mirror Israel in the same time period. One of the things I want to talk about too, when we talk about the romantic side of things, is I think there's an element of Ruth that a lot of us tend to think of, oh, this is some Nicholas Sparks movie kind of book where, you know, they meet and then there's this awkward phase and then they fall in love and then they get married and everything's hunky-dory. But if you look at the history side of things, we see it's more like a romance story that's set in like World War II or something like that, where there's this cataclysmic stuff going on in the background. There's wars, there's, you know, people dying left and right. But there's this glimmer of hope. There's that, the nurse and the American soldier who fall in love. There's, you know, that kind of wartime romance that I think a reading of Ruth deserves a little bit. I think we lose a little bit when we think it's pie in the sky, you know, happy, everybody's happy kind of thing. So I have specific titles for each of the 4 weeks that I got from the Unger's Bible Handbook. And this one, from the very first slide, was Ruth Deciding in Faith. And he kind of gives each title a different, or each chapter of the book rather, a different title. And the one for this one is Ruth Deciding in Faith. Ruth could have gone back to Moab and gotten another husband pretty easily. She was still young, you know, it's not listed that she had any kids or anything like that. She could have left Naomi and gone back and had a pleasant life. She could have even gone back for her family. You know, at the very least, if she didn't get remarried, it said that she still had family back in Moab that would take care of her. But Naomi means something to her, and she knows that without her help, she will probably die pretty soon. And I like the picture here of faith in the dark, where sometimes when we're in a dark period in our life, like Ruth is here, there's the element where sometimes we see the future as the dark place that we're kind of reaching our hand into. You know, Ruth would have felt this tremendously going back to Judah and Naomi. But there's also this element that sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes we're not reaching into the dark, sometimes we're reaching out of the dark into the light. And I like to think that this is kind of what Ruth is doing. You know, to her this might have felt the opposite, but when we're reading it, we see that she's going from a dark place of pagan worship and, you know, not being with God and all of these things, and reaching through faith into the light. Naomi was the catalyst for this. She was the one who enabled this to happen. But there's something to be said about the tremendous faith of Ruth to be able to do something like this. The next couple of weeks we're going to look at, you know, Ruth's love, Ruth's steadfastness and stuff like that. But this chapter really shows off her faith. And it's weird because when we talk about faith, oftentimes we talk about, you know, like me having really strong faith or Rhonda having really strong faith. But Ruth doesn't have any faith here. She doesn't, so far as we know, she doesn't even know God other than perhaps through her husband. So because of Naomi being the catalyst here, we see that she comes to God and then furthers his kingdom through that. What kind of lessons of faith do you think we can glean from Ruth in this chapter? Or how can we perhaps take the faith of Ruth to heart?
You don't have very smart students.
That's all right. One of the ways is being not unafraid, but having the courage to step into the unknown. Our church is kind of going through this right now. There's a lot of questions of, if we're having events, are we going to be able to do them? If we're going to plan this, are we going to have people to show up and help? If we, is the church going to be able to afford this or that kind of thing. But there's something to be said about the faith of saying, we don't know, but we're going to try and do it anyway. There's something to be said about saying, we're not sure if it'll work out, but God will provide regardless. And in that, we can kind of emulate the faith of Ruth. And I think each week we're going to go through one key thing from each chapter. And the one from this chapter is faith. Taking that faith and running with it. Our church also is kind of going through this with not having a Bob anymore. There's that unknown of, who's going to apply for it? Who are we going to hire next? If we do hire somebody, how long are they going to stay for? And these are all questions that none of us have answers for. As much as we'd love to have answers for them. We'd love to know how many people are going to show up and help the lunch. We'd love to know how many people are going to show up to Bible study on Saturday or church on Sunday, or we want to know how much longer the church can survive the way we're doing things right now. But there's something to be said about saying to God, we don't know, but we're willing to trust in you because we know that you have good things for us. Now, having said that, it's a lot easier to say that than it is to actually practice it. When I was finishing basic and I felt the call to ministry, there was that fear of saying, well, what if I'm wrong? What if this isn't the path I'm supposed to take? I want to stay in the military. I don't want to go be a pastor. There's fear in stepping into the unknown, regardless if that's through the church or if it's through something in your personal life, like a surgery or something, or getting married, or there's fear to that because we don't know how things are going to end. Ruth did not know how things were going to end. She could have died with Naomi pretty soon after they got back to Judah. But she decided to go anyway. She reached into the dark and had faith in God that what was in the dark wouldn't hurt her. And when I was saying my prayer that sometimes it's hard to see God in those darkest moments, there's truth to that. One of the things that we as Protestants struggle with is if we don't feel that warm, fuzzy feeling in the center of our chest when we're in church, we think, oh, God's not here with us, where did God go? That's not really the truth. God is more than a warm, fuzzy feeling in the center of your chest. God is with us, whether we like it or not. And Ruth exemplifies this. Ruth didn't even know God at this point, but she's willing to trust in him anyway. Esther went to the king under fear of death. Ruth goes to a foreign land, forsakes her identity to live in poverty under fear of war. Who sacrificed more? Or who had a greater fear, I guess? And I don't think this is a question that really can be answered. Both people sacrificed quite a great deal for their people. But the sacrifice and the faith that Ruth has here is often overlooked by the romantic story of the rest of the book. And I think it's one that we can really take to heart. Having that kind of faith is important, and it's something that we're called to do. Any questions before we stop the word of prayer?
No, but I just think of when we put this basement here, it was a big step for us, and we didn't know if we could afford to do it. what happened, what we did. But we had to step out in faith and try it.
Exactly. It's not easy.
No.
You know, trusting in God's word, even when God's word is calling you someplace that's dangerous, or like financially cripple the church, or something like that is not easy. But it's needed. That's a really good example.
Yeah. I think in our church, every time we needed something or felt we wanted something, a well, a new roof, like this basement, whatever, there's always that faith there that somehow you're going to be able to obtain it and pay for it and continue on.
I'm always amazed at how churches always get so scared about doing something. Even though we have stories in the New Testament about Jesus, like the loaves and fishes. And the story of the church getting this basement is the same stories as the miracle of the loaves and fishes. But every time the church goes to do something new, there's always that fear and anxiety. But the moment we do it, I can almost guarantee you that charter luncheon is going to go over fantastic. Even though we're all so worried about it.
On this side.
Yeah, this side of the church.
Yeah. I guess in life for me is when I was first married, everything, like you say, hunky-dory. Well, it was great. A couple of years later, the first child comes along, okay, great. And I just thought, nothing was going to change. Everything was going to be. But as years go on, everything changes. Doesn't always get better until sometimes it gets worse first, and then it gets better. But there's always a change in life, regardless.
And part of life and part of what we're called to do as Christians is being willing to change along with it.
Right.
You can't always be the same person through every season of your life.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. And if you try to do that, I'm sorry, you're going to go through some struggles.
Right. You grow as you go.
Exactly. And we have to have faith that as we go through it, God will be there for us. He gives good gifts to his children. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for the story of Ruth. We thank you for her example of faith that we can take to heart. Lord, as we look at our church, it's easy to be afraid. It's easy to have anxiety and fear about where things are going. But Lord, help grant us the faith of Ruth to be able to reach out of the dark or even into the dark and say, regardless of where we're going or whether or not we can do this, we are going to trust you. We're not going to trust our bank account. We're not going to trust even the people in our church sometimes. We're going to trust God, and that at the end of the day, you will pull through and you have good gifts for your children. Lord, give us the strength to accept the things that we cannot change, but also give us the courage to change the things that we know we should. Lord, grant us faith, grant us fear, or grant us relief from fear and anxiety. And please help us as we go along this week, thinking about the faith of Ruth. This we pray in your holy name. Amen.